All right, so you wanted to dive into Exodus chapter 21 from the King James Version of the Bible.
We're going to do it.
Let's get right to it. This chapter lays out some
Fascinating.
some fascinating societal laws,
Yeah.
and it gives us a peek into life back then.
It's important to remember this was a very different time
Oh, yeah.
with a very different social structure.
Totally.
We're going to see how they dealt with things like personal injury, property damage, and even what happened when an ox went rogue.
Okay, I am ready for some rogue oxen.
Let's do it.
Let's start with this whole concept of servitude and freedom.
Okay.
Right off the bat, we see these rules about Hebrew servants.
Yes.
6 years of service, and then they're free.
Right.
That seventh year rolls around, and boom, they're out.
Yep.
But it's not as simple as it sounds, is it?
Not quite. Things get a little more complicated when you factor in marriage and family.
Okay.
So if a servant entered service as a single person, they'd leave alone.
Right.
Makes sense. But
Yeah.
if they were already married, their spouse went with them.
Okay.
And here's where it gets really interesting,
Okay.
for me at least. If the master provided a wife during the servitude
Oh, wow.
and they had kids, only the servant goes free. The wife and children stayed behind.
Wait, seriously, so you could be forced into marriage, have kids, and then be ripped away from your family when your service is up?
Yeah.
That seems
It's rough.
incredibly harsh.
It does. To our modern sensibilities, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of how different their concept of family and ownership was back then.
Wow.
It's also worth noting that a servant could choose to stay with their master indefinitely.
Really?
They'd even get their ear pierced as a symbol of this commitment.
Okay, hold up, a pierced ear for lifelong servitude.
That's right.
That's quite the commitment.
Talk about dedication.
It makes you wonder what the conditions were really like.
Yeah.
Was it truly a choice?
Right.
Or were these servants just trying to make the best of a bad situation? Maybe it was about loyalty to a master who treated them well, or maybe they just didn't see a viable alternative.
Right.
There's a whole layer of social and economic factors we can only guess at.
Exactly. It's like a historical puzzle.
Totally.
Some missing pieces.
Yeah.
We can analyze the laws, but fully understanding the lived experiences of these servants
Right.
is a challenge.
Yeah, it does make you think, though.
Yeah.
What would drive someone to choose that kind of life?
Absolutely.
Speaking of choices,
Go.
the chapter also dives into the selling of daughters as maidservants.
Right.
That immediately struck me as, well, not great.
I can see why. It sounds pretty jarring to our modern ears.
Yeah.
However, we can't just slap our 21st century judgment on it.
Right.
There are specific rules in place
Okay.
to prevent outright exploitation.
Okay.
If the master didn't meet certain obligations, like finding a suitable husband for the daughter, she was actually entitled to go free.
So there were safeguards, even within a system that sounds pretty problematic to us.
Right.
What kind of obligations did the master have to fulfill?
Yeah.
What constituted suitable in their eyes?
Right.
It makes you think about the power dynamics at play and the limited options available to women in that society.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about her potential freedom.
Okay.
There were rules regarding her treatment and even her future prospects.
Okay.
For example, if the master intended to marry her himself, but then changed his mind,
Right.
he couldn't just sell her off to someone else.
Interesting. So there were consequences for the master if they didn't follow through.
That's right.
It wasn't just a free-for-all.
Nope.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second and talk about something that always gets people riled up, justice and punishment.
That's right.
Exodus 21 lays out this famous eye for an eye principle.
Yep.
But what did that actually mean in practice? Were they walking around plucking out eyes left and right?
The common misconception.
I bet.
Think of it less as literal mutilation and more about proportionate compensation.
Okay,
The punishment had to fit the crime.
gotcha.
If you caused someone to lose an eye,
Right.
you'd have to pay a price that reflected the severity of that loss.
Ah, so it's more about making amends than seeking revenge.
Right.
It's still a harsh system, but at least it attempts to establish a sense of fairness and prevent over-the-top retaliation.
It was a way to limit vendettas and maintain some level of social order.
I see.
Now, here's something else that might seem odd.
Okay.
The punishment for striking a parent was death,
Uh-huh.
but harming a servant had a less severe outcome.
Well, yeah. That seems like a pretty big discrepancy.
Sure.
Were they just saying servants' lives were less valuable?
You have to look at this through the lens of their social structure.
Okay.
Parents held a very high position of authority.
Right.
Striking a parent wasn't just an assault. It was an attack on the foundation of their entire social order.
Okay, so it's all about understanding the cultural context.
Right.
These laws weren't just arbitrary. They reflected the values and priorities of ancient Israel.
Exactly.
What seems strange to us made perfect sense to them.
Exactly. It challenges us to step outside our modern perspective
Yeah.
and try to grasp the complexities of a very different time and place.
All right, ready for something completely different.
Yeah, hit me.
Let's talk about oxen.
Okay.
They were clearly a big deal back then, valuable assets for plowing, hauling, you name it.
For sure.
But what happened when one of these oxen went rogue and decided to, shall we say, use its horns a little too liberally?
Ah, yes. The goring ox.
Yes.
This section gets surprisingly detailed.
Okay.
If an ox gored someone to death, the ox was stoned,
Okay.
and no one could eat its meat.
Oh, wow.
However, the owner wasn't held responsible.
Okay.
Unless,
Here we go. The plot thickens.
right, if the ox was known to be aggressive
Okay.
and the owner was aware but didn't take precautions, the owner could face serious consequences,
Oh,
even death.
wow. So they took this aggressive ox thing very seriously. Yeah.
It wasn't just about the act itself.
Right.
It was about the owner's responsibility to prevent harm.
That's right.
That almost sounds like a precursor to our modern concept of negligence.
It's a fascinating parallel, isn't it?
Yeah.
It shows a developing awareness of the idea that we're responsible for our property
Right.
and its potential impact on others.
And there's another interesting detail.
Okay.
If an ox gored a servant,
Right.
the owner had to pay 30 shekels of silver to the servant's master.
That's right.
So a human life,
Yeah.
even a servant's life, was considered more valuable than an animal.
Exactly.
But it also highlights that servants were still viewed as property,
Yeah. To some extent.
to some extent.
Their worth was measured in financial terms.
It's these little details that really make you think, right?
Absolutely.
They offer a peek into the mindset of a society so far removed from our own.
Absolutely. And we've only just scratched the surface of Exodus 21.
Oh, good.
There's so much more to unpack.
I'm right. So buckle up, because we're just getting started.
I am buckled.
All right.
Let's do it.
Welcome back.
Okay.
We've been exploring the laws laid out in Exodus 21.
We have.
And it's become clear that even seemingly straightforward rules
Right.
can reveal a lot about the society they came from.
Absolutely. It's like these laws are a window into
Yeah.
the values and beliefs and even
Yeah.
the day-to-day challenges of ancient Israel.
Exactly. And sometimes those challenges involved, you guessed it, more oxen.
Oh boy, here we go again.
Back to the oxen.
What kind of bovine drama are we diving into now?
Well, imagine two oxen get into a bit of a tussle,
Okay.
and one ox
Uh-huh.
doesn't walk away from the encounter.
Ox on ox violence. That's got to be a messy situation, even by ancient standards.
It can get messy.
So what happens next? Was it just tough luck? That's life in the farmyard.
Surprisingly, no.
Okay.
The law actually gets quite specific here.
Okay.
If it was a genuine accident, the owners would sell the surviving ox, split the proceeds, and divide the meat of the deceased ox.
Okay, so it was a way of sharing the burden of the loss.
Right.
Makes sense, but I have a feeling there's a but coming.
You know me too well.
Yeah.
The twist is, if the ox had a history of being a bit of a bully,
Okay.
shall we say, and the owner knew about it,
Yeah.
but didn't keep it under control, different rules applied.
Ah, those repeat offender oxen.
That's right.
What happened then?
In those cases, the owner of the aggressive ox had to fully compensate the owner of the deceased ox.
So an ox for an ox, basically. An ox for an ox.
So it's not just about the accident itself.
No,
It's about the owner's responsibility to prevent harm.
that's right.
That's pretty forward-thinking for such an ancient legal system.
Right. It shows they were already grappling with this idea that we're accountable for our property and the actions of those under our care.
It makes you wonder, though, how would they have determined what constituted an aggressive ox?
Was it a one-strike rule, or did the ox have to rack up a certain number of offenses
That's a good question.
before it was labeled a troublemaker?
Unfortunately, the text doesn't provide those specifics.
Okay.
It's likely that judges and elders played a role in interpreting and applying these laws
I see.
based on the circumstances of each case.
I bet those court hearings were interesting.
Oh, I'm sure.
Your Honor, my ox was provoked. He's a gentle giant, I swear.
I can just imagine the arguments.
Yeah.
But it highlights an important point.
Okay.
These laws weren't just cold, hard rules.
Right.
There was room for interpretation, judgment calls, and probably a fair amount of debate.
It's a reminder that even in ancient times, justice wasn't always black and white.
That's right.
There were shades of gray.
For sure.
just like in our modern legal systems.
Speaking of shades of gray, let's revisit a topic we touched on earlier,
Okay.
the laws regarding Hebrew servants.
Right.
It's one of the most complex and frankly challenging aspects of Exodus 21.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile those laws with our modern understanding of freedom and human rights.
Yeah.
The idea that someone could be forced into service, even for a limited time,
Right.
it's difficult to stomach.
I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
It's essential to acknowledge the dissonance we feel
Yeah.
when encountering these ancient practices.
Right.
But to truly understand them, we need to step back from our present-day perspective
Okay.
and consider the social norms and economic realities of that time.
Okay, so help me understand.
Sure.
What was the rationale behind this system of servitude?
Well, for one, it was a way to address poverty and indebtedness.
Okay.
People who couldn't support themselves or their families
Right.
could enter into servitude as a means of survival.
So it was almost like a safety net, albeit a very restrictive one?
In a sense, yes. It wasn't necessarily intended to be a system of oppression, though it certainly had the potential for abuse.
Right, and we already discussed how families could be separated under these laws. If a servant entered service unmarried and was given a wife during that time, she and any children remained with the master when the servant's term was up.
Yes, that aspect is undoubtedly the most troubling to modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
It reflects a view of women and children as part of a man's property,
Mm-hmm.
which is, of course, abhorrent to us today.
It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in terms of recognizing the inherent rights and dignity of every human being.
Absolutely.
But it also underscores the importance of understanding history,
Yes.
even its uncomfortable parts.
Absolutely.
Now, I can't let us move on without addressing the elephant, or perhaps the ox, in the room.
Okay.
We talked about the responsibility of owners for aggressive oxen.
Right.
But what about when an ox injured a free person,
Uh-huh.
not a servant?
Good point. The law distinguishes between those cases as well.
Okay.
If an ox gored a free person and the owner knew the ox had a history of aggression,
Right.
but didn't take precautions, the penalty could be death for the owner, and the ox would also be stoned.
Wow, they really weren't messing around with those dangerous oxen. But what if the ox had no prior history of aggression?
Right.
Was the owner still held liable?
That's where things get a bit nuanced.
Okay.
If it was the ox's first offense,
Mm-hmm.
the owner would only have to pay a fine to the injured person.
Okay.
It suggests that the law recognized the difference between intentional negligence and an unfortunate accident.
So there was an attempt to differentiate between levels of culpability. Even back then,
Yeah.
they were already wrestling with questions of intent, foreseeability, and proportionate punishment.
Precisely. It shows that even these ancient laws weren't just a simplistic set of rules.
Right.
They were grappling with complex legal concepts
Yeah.
that we still debate today.
It's amazing how these seemingly archaic laws can spark such relevant discussions about justice, responsibility, and the evolving nature of our legal systems.
It is.
But I have to admit, I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of these nuances.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in. Sometimes it's helpful to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
We've been focusing on individual laws, but what do they tell us about the overall values and priorities of this ancient society?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
What overarching themes emerge from these laws?
Well, one theme that stands out is the emphasis on order and social stability.
Okay.
These laws, as harsh as some of them may seem to us,
Right.
were designed to regulate behavior, resolve disputes,
Uh-huh.
and ultimately prevent chaos.
That makes sense. In a society without our modern law enforcement and judicial systems,
Right.
clear rules and consequences were crucial for maintaining peace and security.
Exactly. And another key theme is the concept of responsibility,
Okay.
both personal and communal.
Yeah.
We've seen it in the laws regarding oxen, servants,
Right.
and even family relationships.
Right.
There's this underlying idea that your actions have consequences, not
Okay.
just for you, but for those around you.
It's a powerful message. Even thousands of years later,
Yeah.
we're all interconnected.
And our choices impact others, for better or worse.
Absolutely. And that sense of interconnectedness is also reflected in the emphasis on restorative justice.
Okay.
We've talked about proportionate punishment.
Right.
But many of these laws also focus on making amends, compensating victims, and restoring balance to the community.
So it wasn't just about punishment.
Right.
It was also about healing and reconciliation.
That's right.
That's a surprisingly progressive aspect of this ancient legal system.
Right. It challenges us to think about how our modern justice systems could incorporate more restorative practices.
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
It is.
These ancient laws, despite their flaws and limitations,
Right.
offer valuable insights that can inform our understanding of justice and inspire us to seek more humane and effective approaches to resolving conflicts and addressing harm.
I couldn't agree more. It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of dusty old stories.
Yeah.
It's a source of wisdom and inspiration.
That can guide us as we navigate the complexities of our own time.
We've been on quite a journey through this legal landscape of ancient Israel.
We have
We've explored everything from ox-related incidents.
lots of oxen.
Yeah, lots of oxen.
It's the theme.
To the complexities of servitude. It's amazing how much these laws reveal about their society, their values,
Yeah.
their challenges, their attempts to create order,
Right.
in a world that must have felt pretty chaotic at times.
It's a testament to the enduring power of law
Yeah.
as a tool for shaping human behavior and establishing a framework for social cohesion.
I like that.
Even in a society so different from our own,
Right.
we can see those same fundamental human impulses at play.
Yeah.
The desire for fairness, the need for accountability,
Yeah.
and the ongoing struggle to balance individual rights with the well-being of the community.
Absolutely. And speaking of enduring legal principles, there's one we haven't tackled yet that has echoed through history and continues to spark debate even today.
What's that?
I'm talking, of course, about the famous eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth principle.
Oh, yeah.
It's probably one of the most well-known
I would say so.
and often misunderstood concepts from Exodus 21.
It gets a lot of attention.
It does.
You're right. It's a phrase that's often invoked
Yeah.
to conjure images of brutal retribution
Right.
and a harsh, unforgiving legal system.
Totally.
But as with many things in Exodus 21,
Right.
there's more to this principle than meets the eye.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
All right.
What was the real intention behind an eye for an eye? Were they literally going around taking an eye for an eye?
Well, not quite.
Okay.
The key here, I think, is understanding this principle of lex talionis,
Okay.
which is the idea of proportionate punishment.
Okay.
This wasn't about seeking revenge.
Right.
It was about establishing a system of justice that aimed to limit violence and prevent excessive retaliation.
So instead of escalating cycles of revenge where each offense leads to a greater act of retribution, they tried to create a system that capped the punishment, ensuring it didn't exceed the crime.
Right, exactly.
Oh.
Imagine a society without such a principle.
Yeah.
Someone steals a loaf of bread,
Uh-huh.
and the victim, seeking revenge, burns down the thief's house.
Okay.
That act then triggers a more severe retaliation from the thief's family,
Oh, wow.
and so on and so on.
Right.
It creates this spiral of violence that can tear a community apart.
So an eye for an eye was actually a way to break that cycle,
Idea that.
to introduce a measure of restraint into the system.
That's right.
It was about establishing a sense of fairness where the punishment fit the crime, preventing things from spiraling out of control.
It was a way to impose order on what could easily become chaos.
Yeah.
It was about maintaining social stability,
Right.
which was essential for the survival of any community, especially in those times.
It makes you appreciate how challenging it must have been to create a system of justice that worked, that could effectively address harm and maintain order without descending into anarchy.
Yeah. And it's fascinating how these ancient concerns still resonate with us today.
They do, don't they?
Yeah.
We still grapple with these same fundamental questions.
Totally.
How do we balance the need for accountability with the desire for rehabilitation?
Yeah.
How do we create a justice system that is both fair and effective? How do we ensure that punishment serves a purpose beyond mere retribution?
It's like these laws from thousands of years ago are holding up a mirror to our own society.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Forcing us to confront the complexities of justice and to examine our own values and beliefs.
That's the power of studying history, isn't it?
Yeah.
It allows us to step outside of our own time and place
Like,
to gain a new perspective on our own challenges
Right.
and aspirations.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Exodus 21.
A lot of ground.
We've explored laws that seem strange and even shocking to our modern sensibilities. But we've also uncovered principles that resonate with our own values.
And legal systems.
Sure.
It's been a fascinating journey through this legal landscape of ancient Israel.
Yeah.
A glimpse into a society grappling with many of the same fundamental challenges that we face today.
And it's a reminder that law is not just a set of rules.
Right.
It's a reflection of a society's values, beliefs,
Uh-huh.
and aspirations.
Yeah.
It's a living, evolving entity that shapes and is shaped by the people it governs.
Right.
By studying the laws of the past,
Yeah.
we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the challenges we face
Right.
as we strive to create a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into Exodus 21.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.